Good afternoon. I'm Judy Woodward, the History Coordinator of the Ramsey County Library, and it is my great pleasure to welcome you to this first History Talk for 2023, also the first talk in J.B. Andersen's new series, Washington and Adams, a new look at two founding fathers. Our topic today is Washington creates the office of President of the United States. And now let me turn things over to our speaker, J.B. Andersen, for this talk on Washington creates the office of the President of the United States. Thank you.
Good, I managed to do it. When we've talked about Washington previously during the last quarter, we got him up to the 1780s, so we're going to begin with that period of time. And we're going to talk a little bit, several slides here before he became president. Then we'll talk about his inauguration, etc. First of all, 1788, so we're just a year from Washington being elected president. He accepted the position of chancellor at William and Mary College. I have an entry sign posted here as a graphic along with one of the main buildings at William and Mary College. And it's located in Williamsburg, Pennsylvania. Here's a map of Pennsylvania. And where you see the red star is roughly where Williamsburg is located. So you can see it's a place that has easy access to the Atlantic Ocean. He remained chancellor to his death, so he never left the office and remained chancellor throughout his 8 years as president of the United States. Now, a lot of people say this should not have been tolerated. It's a conflict of interest. And in a few slides, we're going to talk about conflicts of interest as a side note. This was a position at a private college. Now, William and Mary did become public, but not until 1906, like, over 100 years after Washington's death. Washington attended William and Mary University. It's where he got his surveyor's license. And the graphic on this page is a drawing at the top by Washington and writing by Washington about a survey that he did. So this was one of his reports to a landowner showing the extent of their property and then a written description of it also. Conflict of interest may have happened more recently and actually throughout our history. Under Donald Trump, the Secret Service had to stay at Trump-owned hotels, particularly in Mar-a-Lago in Florida, where Trump visited pretty regularly to go golfing. Is this a direct violation of the presidency? Many would say it is. Many presidents have sold off everything that they have, put it all into the hands of a private investor who then secretly has invested the money in businesses and money-making options for the president without the president knowing where those investments are held. So this is a bit of a diversion, but let's talk about it for a few slides here. Charges at Donald Trump hotels. Rooms run from $650 to $1,185 per night. Now, during the 4 years of the Trump presidency, $1.4 million was spent housing Secret Service agents in Trump hotels. $650 to $1185. That's an average of about $900 for a room. One guy staying in a room at $900 a night could stay at Mar-a-Lago, for instance, for 1,555 nights. Now, in the 4 years of a presidential term, there's only 1,460 days. But there might be 10 guards staying in these rooms. So here is Mar-a-Lago in Florida. Large swimming pool, large open patio area, etc. Since the Civil War, presidents have favored corporations. Presidents before the Civil War were largely agricultural, especially Thomas Jefferson, who said a democracy could not be maintained in an industrial economy. He said it's got to be people working the land. Theodore Roosevelt is an exception to favoring corporations. He passed a tremendous amount of regulatory legislation against corporations, although it was started in the 1890s by John Sherman, a senator who was a brother to William Tecumseh Sherman, the famous Civil War general. John Sherman got passed the Sherman Antitrust Act, which stated that corporations could not line themselves up with each other and share boards together, etc. So let's take a look at some presidents from, and we're going to do Herbert Hoover up through Donald Trump. Here's a picture of Gerald Ford fishing. Here's a chart of presidents and the number of days they spent on vacation during their term of office. And these are sorted by the days per year average, how many days per year were on vacation. And again, it's from Hoover through Trump. Now, I could not find information, and if you look at the bottom of the chart, on Ford, Nixon, or Kennedy. So we've got these other presidents since Hoover, other than Ford, Nixon, and Kennedy. The winner is George H.W. Bush, who spent 543 days on vacation. That's 134 days a year. That's a giant number. He was at Kennebunkport. Remember that? His vacation home in Maine. And second place goes to his son, George W. Bush, who spent a great deal of time at his ranch in Texas. 1,020 days in 8 years. That's 127 days per year on vacation. Ronald Reagan is in third place in 8 years, 866 days. That's about 108 days per year. Now, like 134 days, the record by H.W. Bush. That's 3 months and 2 weeks, or 4 months and 2 weeks every year on average. Fourth place goes to Donald Trump, spent 381 days in 4 years. That's an average of 95 days a year. That's over 3 months at a vacation site. Lyndon Johnson, 484 days. That's an average of 80 per year for the almost 6 years that he was president. Franklin Roosevelt, in 12 years in office, did 958 days of vacation. That's 80 days a year, also under 3 months. Eisenhower did 456 days in 8 years. That's 57 days a year. Clinton 345 for 8 years, 43 days a year. Obama 328 or 41 days a year over an 8-year period. Truman also served 8 years. He was a month short of having served 8 years. He did 175 days. That's 22 per year. Jimmy Carter in 4 years had 79 days of vacation. That's 20 a year. And Herbert Hoover is, I don't know, the winner or the loser, whatever you want to call him, 49 days in 4 years. That's about 12 days per year on vacation. So let's take a little closer a look. Republicans there were 6 Republicans that I have figures on, and 6 Democrats, Hoover through Trump. The Republicans averaged 89 days per year on vacation, and the Democrats averaged 53 days per year. Criticisms about presidents. Let's take a look at some of that and what was said about it, and especially in terms of it being time away from office. John Adams, the Federalist, was criticized by the Democrats for spending time caring for his wife, who was sick through a good portion of his presidency. James Garfield, presidents were not guarded yet in the late 1800s, and Garfield was shot while leaving for a vacation at a railroad station in Washington, D.C. So President's Secret Service didn't exist yet. The president was unguarded, went by himself to the railroad station in order to take a train up into state of New York, where he was going to deliver a speech and spend several days on vacation. And he was shot by a disgruntled office seeker in that train station. Teddy Roosevelt was criticized. He would be gone from Washington, D.C. for months at a time during the nearly 8 years that he was president. And he was a hunter. So he'd go out into remote areas and do a great deal of hunting. Franklin Roosevelt, spending too much time on his yacht. He had a yacht that went out onto the ocean, but also he spent a great deal of time at Warm Springs, which was a resort area with hot springs in it. And Roosevelt had bought that facility during the 1930s so that he could go there, and supposedly the heat could help with the inability to walk that he had. There's a lot of debate as to whether he had polio or not. At any rate, he could not walk after the early 1920s. And the warmth of the water was thought to help. Also, for people who cannot walk, being in the water, you know, you kind of float and you feel like you can stand up straight, and you can kind of move your arms and feel like you're walking also, as it buoys you up. George W. Bush, criticized by Democrats regularly, took very long vacations. He's in second place for the most vacation days per year. Usually he was going to his ranch in Crawford, Texas. There's lots of pictures of him going around picking up twigs, cleaning up the forest bed on his ranch, and all of this during the Iraq War, which was the central reason for the criticism. You're on vacation and there's a war underway. And a lot of people that worked for Bush and other people who would come to visit him said they walk in on him and he was playing video games, computer games. So there's lots of recreation time in addition to not being in Washington, D.C. Here is Bush giving the Presidential Medal of Freedom to Ralph Baer, who was known as the father of home video games. Barack Obama's vacations. The media was the major criticism of Obama concerning vacations. During a 5-year period of his 8 years as president, he was criticized for vacationing at Martha's Vineyard, a place that he really came to like. After his presidency, he bought the $12 million mansion that you see here. You walk out this side of the mansion that we can see, and you're looking at the Atlantic Ocean. Where did Obama, who did not have a great deal of money, get $12 million to buy this mansion? Well, as soon as he left the presidency, a book publisher came to him and said, all the books you and your wife write up to your deaths, we will own, and we will get to publish them in perpetuity. Here's $60 million. So he had enough money to buy a mansion worth several $1 million in Washington, D.C., where his daughter was still a high school student after he left the presidency, and then eventually to buy this very large mansion on the waterfront at Martha's Vineyard. And the vacations that he took were criticized during his presidency. Donald Trump has lots of information. There were lots of concerns about his vacations. We're going to take a look at 3 items. May of 2019, criticism was for expenses. Golf trips had totaled, now this is, he's got a few months left in his presidency here, but golf trips had cost $102 million. Trips to Florida, that's Mar-a-Lago, also primarily golf trips, $81 million. He went to New Jersey and $17 million was spent on trips to New Jersey. He went to Scotland for just 2 days. That trip cost $3 million. And he made a single trip to Los Angeles at a cost of $1 million. Here's Donald in a sand trap. Total cost of these trips was $204 million. Now, previously here I said 1.4 million, but remember that was hotel expenses for the Secret Service alone. So a total during the first 3 years and 3 months of Trump's administration, vacation time totaled $204 million worth of expenses. Trump talked about working vacations. You're never really on vacation. You got advisors with you. You got things to do. That's how it was when he was in business, etc. So he justified these lengthy stays at resorts as working vacations. Also stated while he was campaigning, I would not be a president who took vacations. I would not be a president that takes time off. Here's Donald Trump in the rough. Now, finally, back to Washington. But the important issue here is what counts as a vacation? How many days are spent away from Washington, D.C.? Should this be a matter of concern? Many of the days spent away are, negotiations with other countries and so on. Many of them are indeed vacation days. So Okay, let's talk about the first presidential election of 1789. And of course, that involved George Washington. What powers is the president going to have? The Continental Congress, which was the name of the Congress under the Articles of Confederation up until the Constitution was adopted in 1789, and we had our first election for president. The Continental Congress had assumed that once the Constitution took over and Washington became the first president, he would determine what will the powers be that a president has got. So they started to, there started to be lots of talk about this and concern about it. And the Continental Congress just finally simply said, it's a whole new form of government. We think Washington will be able to decide these things. Reminder, no class next week, 18 January. The library has other issues that day. So I will see you 2 weeks from today. First presidential election, again, let's talk about the inauguration. Now, in the Constitution, inaugurations were set for March 4th of the year after the election. So 1788, first Tuesday in November, you have an election for the president who does not take office until March 4th. That's 4 months later. Why so long? Well, you're talking about riding a horse and carriage to get to Washington, D.C. from wherever you lived. You didn't travel very fast in 1789. Now, unfortunately for Washington, the electoral vote was not counted until April 5th, a month after he should have taken the oath of office. So finally it was decided that, yeah, you got all the electoral votes, nobody else gets any. I mean, nobody ran against the guy even. New York City was the capital of the United States at the time, and that's where Washington took the oath of office, but that wasn't until April 30th that occurred. Crowd was estimated at 10,000. This is a giant crowd. It's 1789. Population of the United States is smallish. And this is in New York City. And here's a painting of that inauguration. Pay special note to the railing that they're standing at in this building. Here is the railing. It's on display at the City Museum of New York. It was removed from that building and just stands alone as a railing. And I've been to that museum, and I've stood at this fence. So Inauguration Day, finally, April 30th. Washington was president 7 weeks short of 8 years, actually, because of the delays in determining the electoral vote. Washington was a Mason. Whether you were a member of a secret society or not, became a major issue in the 1824, 1828 campaigns, with John Quincy Adams arguing there's no place for secret societies in a democracy. But for Washington, he was a Mason. He'd been one since for many years. And the Masons provided the Bible that he swore the oath of office on. And here's a picture of that Bible on display that Washington took the oath on. Washington kissed the Bible. Every president followed that practice of kissing the Bible up until Eisenhower, who obviously was a non-kisser. But Eisenhower may have had a reason. It was a leather-bound Bible, and leather comes from a cow's behind. John Quincy Adams and Theodore Roosevelt did not use a Bible. Adams was a Unitarian, did not believe in the divinity of Christ, and he took the oath on a book of laws. And Lyndon Johnson, Kennedy'd been assassinated. Johnson had accompanied him to Texas. They got on the airplane. Okay, Johnson, you need to take the oath of office on the airplane. They couldn't find a Bible on the airplane. But Kennedy, who had taken that plane to Texas, had a Catholic missal book that he brought on board with him. So Lyndon Johnson took the oath of office on Kennedy's Catholic missal book. Chester Alan Arthur, when he took the oath of office in 1881, he added after the oath, "So help me God." And every president since 1881 has now said that at the conclusion of the oath taking. Quakers are opposed to oaths. They don't believe in them. They say that it's biblical. I'll show you where they get that information from. Both Hoover and Nixon were Quakers, but they took the oath of office for president anyway. So what's the Bible say about oaths? But above all things, my brethren, swear not, neither by heaven, neither by the earth, neither by any other oath, but let your yea be yea, and your nay, nay, lest ye fall into condemnation. That's from the New Testament, King James Version quote. So, swear not in the Bible. Washington's presidency, we're going to talk about domestic issues, and there were a total of 5 major precedents that Washington set. So let's take a look at those. Washington established a presidential title. What do we call this person? And we'll talk about that. Speeches. What speeches will a president give? What speeches should be regular? Like we'll talk about what became regular. Can the president have advisors? What should there be a term limit? There's none in the Constitution. But should we just set one, set a precedent that is not legal in nature? And transition of office. What happens when we change from one president to another president? So what do you call the president? The Federalists under John Adams were very interested in the presidency being very much like a royal position, like the king had been in England. And John Adams and the Federalists said president should be called His Excellency or Your Excellency when you're greeting him. Or you could say Your Highness, the President, as a greeting. Nice to meet you, Your Highness, the President. It was Washington that established, call me Mr. President. And that is the phrase that has remained in common use since 1789. Speeches. Well, Washington took the oath of office. That was his inauguration. And he said, I'm going to make a speech afterwards. I'll have an address. And he wrote it out in longhand, and every president since has given an inaugural address. They continue to the present day. So that's a once every 4 years occurrence, an inaugural speech. Now there's an annual address before Congress, and it's titled the State of the Union, and Washington did these also, and they're done annually. What's in it? Here's legislation that I propose. This is what I'd like to see Congress do during the next year of my term. And here's how the United States is functioning at this point. We've done this, we've done that, and we hope to see this and hope to see that. So State of the Union messages and inaugural addresses. State of the Union address was delivered orally and before Congress. So you got the House of Representatives and the Senate together. They sat together. The president came to the Capitol building and delivered these annual State of the Union addresses. At least Washington and Adams did. Jefferson said, I'm not going to do that. No oral delivery of the State of the Union. And he sent a written message to Congress instead. He started that in 1801. The oral started up again over 100 years later, 112 years later, under Woodrow Wilson. Woodrow Wilson said, I'm not sending a written speech to Congress. I'm going to Congress, as Washington and Adams did. To this day now, over 100 years, presidents have verbally delivered the State of the Union address to members of Congress at the Capitol building. Why did Jefferson stop this? Jefferson had a stutter. It was very pronounced. He didn't like to speak publicly, so he refused most speech making. And people would, when he was in meetings, people would listen patiently while he struggled to get a word out. Advisors. Who's going to advise this president? Article 2, Section 2 of the United States Constitution allows for the president to have advisors. Here's a quote. He shall nominate, and by and with the advice and consent of the Senate, shall appoint ambassadors, other public ministers and councils, judges of the Supreme Court, and all other officers of the United States, whose appointments are not herein otherwise provided for. So the president could say, I want this, I want that, and that's allowed in the Constitution, whose appointments are not herein otherwise provided for. Now, many of these nominations have to get the approval of the Senate, such as all the cabinet members. And presidents started having advisors who they felt, well, these are people that I don't need to have approved by the Senate. Washington appointed advisors. These came to be called the cabinet. And they all came to be called Secretary so-and-so. So Secretary Hamilton, Secretary Knox, etc. Anytime I've got an arrow through a graphic such as here, it means you're going to see a larger representation of the graphic on the next page. In 1789, there were 4 members. A 5th was added, and that was Postmaster General. But here is Washington, a painting with his cabinet. And you can see Secretary of War, which got discontinued, and the Secretary of Defense was started. But under Washington, the Secretary of War was Henry Knox. Secretary of Defense has less harsh a word than Secretary of War. Hence, it was changed in the mid 1900s. Secretary of the Treasury was Alexander Hamilton, and Secretary of State was Thomas Jefferson, and the Attorney General at the Department of Justice, Edmund Randolph, or what's become the Department of Justice. Term limits. Washington served 2 terms. He said, "I'm all done. I'm stepping down. This is long enough. I have no intention of running for a 3rd term," and he did not. And that set a precedent that lasted until 1944 or 1940, when Franklin Roosevelt ran for and was elected to a 3rd term. So 2 terms became standard practice until FDR 1940, who broke that cycle. The Republicans didn't like it. They went berserk at somebody running for a 3rd term, and he ended up serving all of that 3rd term and was elected to a 4th term. Roosevelt was. But the Republicans, who did not like this, got the 22nd Amendment to the Constitution passed. All future presidents are limited to 2 terms or 10 years. Now let's take a look at what do they mean by that. Lyndon Johnson was president for 5.5 years. He had 1.5 years after Kennedy was assassinated. Then he was elected to a term in his own right, another 4 years. That brings him up to 5.5 years. Now you can't serve more than 10. So he could have run again. Another 4 years would have put him at 9.5 years. He's under the 2-term or 10-year limit. Gerald Ford could have served just 1 more term, but not 2 more terms. See, he was president after the resignation of Nixon. He was president for a little over 2 years. It was 2 years and 7 months, a little under 3 years. 1 more term would have put him at 6 years and 7 months. A second 4-year term would have put him at 10 years and 7 months. That's over the 10-year limit. So Gerald Ford ran for 1 more term, but he lost to Jimmy Carter. Had he won that, he could have served out that term and not run for another 4-year term. Again, it would have put him over the 10-year limit. So we now have a legal requirement for how long a president can serve. And that's from the around 1950 roughly. And that superseded the precedent set by George Washington of serving just 2 terms. Term limit. A lot of people say it's a very good idea. The presidency has become imperial. We've got radio and TV media nowadays. It's very easy to follow one person. So the president is all we see. That branch of government has gotten a great deal of attention. You go to Congress, and there's 535 people, 100 senators, 435 representatives. How do you begin to cover them all? It's easier just to cover a single individual, and that individual gets all the attention. it's come to be called the imperial presidency. So limiting someone to 2 terms has not stopped the presidency from becoming overly powerful, which was the concern when Franklin Roosevelt won 2 additional terms beyond the precedent set by George Washington. But the Republicans who supported this 22nd Amendment, because it was a Democrat who'd gotten elected to 4 terms, these Republicans shot themselves in the foot. Eisenhower would have been reelected up until his death. Reagan would still be president, even though he is dead. Transfer of power. How do we get from one president to another? Are there any protocols for that? When George Washington stepped down after 2 terms, and John Adams, who had been Washington's vice president, was elected to the presidency in 1796, it was a very smooth transition. But when Adams when Adams ran against Thomas Jefferson in 1800, things were much more obtuse. These 2 guys did not get along with each other. They did not like each other. And John Adams said, I'm not coming to your inauguration. I'm not approving of you as president. So transfer of power. Here we have the first president who refuses to cooperate in the transfer of power by not attending the inauguration of his successor, who he lost an election to. John Quincy Adams is the second president that did not attend his successor's inauguration. It was a very difficult campaign in 1828. They were accusing each other of incredible things, and John Quincy Adams, as a result, did not attend Andrew Jackson's inauguration. We're going to talk more about that at maybe today or at a later date, about when we get to that period of time. Trump did not attend Biden's inauguration. It was a stolen election. These are the 3 people who did not attend their successors' inaugurations. Domestic issues, partisanship. We're going to talk about domestic issues. We're going to spend a good bit of time on domestic issues in the Washington administration. And the first thing we're going to talk about is the growth of partisanship. This was something that people were concerned about. You know, we need to cooperate with each other. We can't be at each other's throats. We can't be partisans. We can't say it's got to be this way or that way. And let's keep talking to each other. So, was Washington nonpartisan? Generally, lots of people say yes, he was. He didn't want political parties, etc. Well, not really. Washington supported a strong federal government. That was a major issue at the time. The Democrats opposed a strong federal government. Today, they have done a flip-flop on that, and they do indeed favor a strong federal government, but their philosophy has changed. Jefferson was the leading Democrat, and the major concern here was slavery. Strong federal government might undo slavery. So the southern states, and Jefferson as a massive slave owner, owning 600 slaves, and from the state of Virginia was concerned about that. And here we have Washington supporting a strong federal government, Jefferson opposed to that. And the development of political parties. Now, in Washington's day, they were not called political parties, they were called factions. And you didn't want factions to develop, or at least a lot of people didn't. And Washington is generally portrayed as a guy who didn't want political parties, but that's his support for a strong federal government really shows him to be siding with the Federalist Party at the time. This was the major issue of the time. Are we going to have a strong federal government, or are we going to have a weak federal government? Now, we moved from a very weak federal government under the Articles of Confederation, which were in existence from like 1777 to 1789, got rid of that, went to a constitutional government, and many were arguing that that means a strong federal government. Issues here were states' rights versus national rights. We're still hearing this argument today. Lots of people arguing for states' rights. They wanted a weak executive at the federal level. The executive is the president. So weak leadership in the federal government, let the states do what they want. But what about wars? Wars are going to cost money. They already have. The war against Britain for independence led to a great deal of debt. Money became kind of worthless as a result of these increasing debts. And how can we pay these debts off? Who gets to have taxes? So these are some of the partisan issues: states' rights versus national rights. Strong president, weak president. What about debt from war? What about the value of money? And what about raising taxes? Let's talk about cabinet issues and branches of government next. Cabinet was created. Washington appointed these 5 guys: state, war, treasury, attorney general, and postmaster general. Let's take a look at all of this. Let's take a look today. Washington created 5 cabinet offices. Today we have 15, and the postmaster generalship has been eliminated. So here's a list of the 15 cabinet positions: agriculture, attorney general, commerce, defense, education, energy, health and human services, homeland security, the most recent, housing and urban development, interior, labor, state, transportation, treasury, and veterans affairs. Let's take a look at them in the order that they were created. State and Treasury, 1789, and the other offices that disappeared: Postmaster General, Secretary of War. Interior, 1849. We went 50 years there without creating a new cabinet position, and the one that was created was the Secretary of Interior, or the Interior Department. Then the Justice Department. Agriculture, commerce, not till 1913, and as a compromise to the creation of a commerce department supporting business, there was a labor department created. the War Department left 1947, and the Defense Department was created. Housing and Urban Development, 65. Transportation, 67. Energy, 77. Health and Human Services, 79. Department of Education in 79. Veterans Affairs, 88. And Homeland Security, the last department to have been created in 2002 following the 9/11 attacks, especially on the Twin Towers in Manhattan. Cabinet issues, infighting among cabinet members. Here's a picture of Jefferson. Didn't like the federal government, wanted the country to be a states' rights place. Jefferson did not attend the Constitutional Convention. A lot of people say, well, he was in France. Well, he could have easily come home and become a delegate from the state of Virginia. But he said, I wouldn't attend if I was there. The Constitutional Convention met in Philadelphia. Jefferson said about it, I smell a rat in Philadelphia. He was a very strong states' rights advocate. And again, his concern was a strong federal government might abolish slavery. Alexander Hamilton, in opposition to Jefferson, wanted a strong federal government. In particular, he wanted a bank run by the federal government that could control currency, finances, etc., maintain an economy that was stable. So he wanted lots of regulations, lots of economic controls, and it would take a strong federal government to do that rather than a mixed bag of states with different laws and difficulties operating between the different states, etc. Washington, again, is worried about factions. These are what people called political parties in those days. He thought this kind of infighting would destroy the new republic, would destroy the constitutional government that had been created. And Washington had served as the head of that Constitutional Convention. So he was supportive of it and worried about things that might destroy it. One of the things he was worried about was these factions or political parties being created. He supported Hamilton's plans. Remember, Hamilton was the Secretary of Treasury under Washington, and so they were able to work together, especially with finances and especially concerning a national bank and especially about money at the federal government level. Slavery. The South threatened secession and civil war if slavery was not protected. There was talk of this. So here we are, 70 years before the Civil War, and there are already threats of be careful what you do about slavery. It's something that's located only in the South. We're worried the North might gain a lot of power, and what's going to happen to our slave economy then? You'll destroy the agriculture of the South, etc. All of a sudden, they'd have to be paying laborers, so on and so forth. Federal government did three things to protect slavery as a result. And it was actually representatives to the federal government from the southern states that did these protections for slavery. three actions that we're going to talk about that satisfied the South. No freed black person and no slave can ever be a citizen of the United States. So citizenship is denied to any person of color, even if they are a free person. Slaves may not serve in state militias. This would allow them to have firearms. So here, interestingly enough, is an argument from people who want an armed populace against arming certain members of the populace. And they also talk about slaves not being allowed into state militias, which is what the Second Amendment talks about, state militias being necessary, right to bear arms. Does that mean you can have arms if you're not in a state militia? That's the argument made by many people. Others say, yeah, anybody gets to have arms or armaments, and you don't have to be in a state militia. Depends on how you want to interpret that Second Amendment. But here, the South says slaves can't serve in state militias because that would allow them to have guns. And most of the southern states had passed laws, well, they all had passed laws against slaves or freed slaves owning guns. Two states admitted as slave states. So you had the original 13 states. Then the 14th and 15th states to come into the Union were Kentucky and Tennessee. They both came in 1796, and they both came in as slave states. This gave slave states a majority in the United States Senate. So this was a concern in the North, and it was a concern to people who did not like the states' rights argument. Reminder again, next week, no class. I do have a lunch that meets every Monday. We meet at Great Moon Buffet, located in Maplewood. It's on White Bear Avenue, about 3 miles north of Highway 36. I have a mailing list that I put out, talks about coming to lunch, and has a reading usually involved with it, other information that might be of significance. Feel free to write to me if you want to be on that list, and I'll announce the lunch there. Everyone's welcome. Chance to do some face-to-face communication and talking. Okay, we're going to continue with slavery. Washington, this is the Washington presidency that we're talking about. We're in what is a very lengthy section on domestic issues. And we're talking about slavery. And the portion of slavery we're going to talk about next is the Fugitive Slave Act of 1793. Okay, what's a fugitive slave? That's a slave that's run away, broke the bonds of slavery, hiding out somewhere, or moving into the North and being protected by people who do not support slavery. What the Fugitive Slave Act of 1793 says is slave owners can capture their runaway slaves, and they get to return them to the state that they ran away from. So there's no freedom in the North. You got to get all the way to Canada. So slave owners can recapture their runaway slaves and return them to the plantation or There were a lot of slaves that were owned in very small lots, not a plantation, which is a big operation. But there might be one or two slaves, four slaves that would be working for a white person that owned a small business, for instance. Bounty hunting became legalized as a result of slaves escaping, running away. So you had the introduction of a third group of people. You had the slave and the slave owner. Now you got the bounty hunter. They're allowed to recapture, according to the Fugitive Slave Act, any slaves that have run away or gotten into the North. They can find them, tie them up, shackle them, bring them back, and gain a reward from the owner that they had escaped from. Here's a larger portion of that drawing that shows a slave up a tree, dogs barking at the base of the tree, and people with guns, bounty hunters, capturing the slave. If you are a runaway slave and you have a child, that child is a slave also. Even though it's born in free territory, it cannot be free. And that's the Fugitive Slave Act, 1793. Here's a poster from the period. Fugitive slaves, attention. The slave hunter is among us. Be on your guard. An arrest is planned for tonight. Be ready to receive them whenever they come. Well, what did northern states do about this? They passed legislation that said runaway slaves are protected here. You can't do anything to recapture them. So now you got a state law that's in conflict with a federal law, the Fugitive Slave Act. And it's also in conflict with some local laws, like municipal laws, not just state laws. So the North starts passing laws that runaway slaves are welcome here and they're protected here. And the federal law, Fugitive Slave Act, does not apply here. So the states' rights folks, in essence, became hypocrites. Washington, let's talk about an incident in his life concerning slaves. He had a slave named One Judge. And here's a book that was written about her, The Escape of One Judge. Martha Washington's Slave Finds Freedom, and it's by Emily Macaulay. Now, the capital when Washington was president was Philadelphia. It had been moved from New York City. Philadelphia is in Pennsylvania, and Pennsylvania is a free state. Washington's from Virginia himself, and he's got lots of slaves there. Can I bring all these slaves with me to the national capital? Would that be dangerous? Would I be giving up my slaves, maybe? So it was decided that they would take just enough, the Washingtons would, to the capital of Philadelphia to maintain their household. So the Washingtons are living in Philadelphia, the capital city. Now, Pennsylvania is a Quaker state. Quakers are anti-slavery. Here's a picture of a Quaker meeting. Everyone sits quietly, and it's more meditation with an occasional comment being made at a worship service. Well, recapturing One Judge became something that the Washingtons want to do. She simply walked away from the Washington residence in Philadelphia and continued to live in Philadelphia as a free person and protected by many people in Pennsylvania, the northern state, and by Quakers who did not support slavery. Well, Washington's nephew found her in the city of Philadelphia and had a conversation with her. Please return of your own free will. You know, he felt like if he could get her to do that, then there'd be no violation of northern state laws that said this is a free woman. But he could not get her to return to the Washingtons of her own free will. At the time this happened, everything was kept quiet. Washingtons didn't want it known that they had an escaped slave, especially since they were living in the anti-slavery state of Pennsylvania. So hush. Here's another book about One Judge. You can see her name spelled different. It's not O-N-E-Y, it's O-N-A here. And this is a children's book called Never Caught, the story of One Judge. Eventually, to protect herself from Philadelphia, which was the national capital, and concerns about being returned to slavery, she moved further north to the state of New Hampshire. And she had a child in New Hampshire. Now, by law, by federal law, that child is a slave also. Those are laws, that is a law that was passed by Southerners, but at the federal level, hence the hypocrisy. The Southerners were, hey, states' rights is what counts, yet they go to the federal government to get a law passed about runaway slaves. By law, this woman is owned by heirs to the Washington estate. So she's living in New Hampshire. Both George and Martha Washington have died, but she has been passed along to the heirs of George and Martha, who now own her. Here's William Lloyd Garrison. William Lloyd Garrison was an early and outspoken anti-slavery individual. He founded the Liberator, was a magazine that came out regularly, and it was anti-slavery. Now, in 1847, here we are, it's almost 50 years after George Washington has died, One Judge is still alive. And it's 51 years after she has escaped from the Washingtons living in Philadelphia. But she's still in danger. The same laws still apply. And William Lloyd Garrison ran her story. There came to be a Supreme Court decision called Prigg versus Pennsylvania in 1842. And Prigg was a bounty hunter. So he was one of these guys, third party, that was allowed to go into northern states and find runaway slaves, recapture them, and return them to their owner. And he had captured a female slave who was a runaway. And here is a book about this Supreme Court case. Prigg versus Pennsylvania is the title of it, by H. Robert Baker. So the Supreme Court overturned Prigg's capture of this female slave. Bounty hunt, as a result, Pennsylvania said, no, you can't return that slave. Supreme Court said, yes, he can. Well, now bounty hunting booms. It's 1842. All of a sudden, you got a federal Supreme Court decision that says anybody can go into these northern states, as Prigg did, and capture slaves and return them. So lots more people got involved. It became a big money-making industry that now had legal support. Next thing we're going to talk about as one of the major domestic issues, slavery under the Washington presidency, is the Slave Trade Act. That should say 1894, not 1994, of 18, and it should say 1794. I'm going to get this right eventually. So 1794, the Slave Trade Act. End the slave trade by all U.S. owned ships is what this did. By the way, I used to deliberately make mistakes like this when I had traditional age students. And I'd tell you, you get 5 extra points anytime you find a mistake by me on a transparency or something I say or so on. Anyhow, here, the United States is still involved in capturing Africans and bringing them to the Americas and selling them into slavery. The Slave Trade Act of 1794 ended the slave trade for any ships owned by the United States or United States merchants. So other countries were not excluded. So some other country could bring slaves into the United States. The reason for this is the US can't control other countries, or that was the reason given anyway, but that just simply is incorrect. We make trade agreements with other countries, and we've done that all throughout our history. The real reason is US slave owners were enriched. You keep bringing slaves in from Africa and sell them. How does that benefit a United States slave owner? If you can get your slaves to breed, and that is the only way that someone else can buy a slave, you're enriching people who already own slaves in the United States. So breeding takes a higher priority than does importation of slaves. Here's a book on slave breeding by Smithers, if you're interested in that topic. Testing the Law. This is Mr. Brown. He owned a ship named Hope, and he was a US citizen, and he brought slaves from Africa in violation of this law. He was found guilty. He was fined 200 pounds. That's about $900 in the late 1700s. By inflation, in 2020, that's about $60,000. So this is a very healthy fine. He also had to forfeit his ship. Average cost of a ship at this time was about $300,000. That'd be about $6 million in 2020. So this guy gave up a tremendous amount of wealth by violating this Slave Trade Act of 1794. He and members of his family founded Brown University. Hey, if Jerry Crane's out there, he's a friend of mine who went to Brown University. It's an Ivy League school, and it was this guy's family that founded that school. It's based on slave money. It's located in Providence, Rhode Island. Brown was also a founding father. He was involved in the Gaspee affair. This was a British ship, and the British ship was burned by loyalists during the American Revolution. So here's a British ship being burned with our War of Independence. Here's a kind of a political cartoon. Critical race theory, you can't teach that. You're saying that race was, that this was some horrible thing. And so another name for critical race theory is actual American history. Judy, how are we doing for questions?
Well, JB, we have several questions in the column here. We've got about 10 minutes left, so if this is a good stopping place, we can go on from here. Would you
Okay.
like to do that?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right. Before I start reading questions, I do just want to remind people again, there will be no class next Wednesday. That's because we're going to have the library-sponsored history book club, but we will be back 2 weeks from today. So, okay, let's see. We do have some questions here. First question has to do with, if you recall at the beginning of your talk, you were summarizing the vacation periods taken by various presidents over the centuries. This person comments, we need to consider many of our presidents, we need to consider that they are working remotely while they are away on vacation. So those are working vacations. Do you want
Yeah,
to
and that's
disagree
exactly
with that, or?
that is exactly what Donald Trump said. These are working vacations. The president never escapes the duties of his office. So, yes, that's
Okay,
right.
all right. Okay, the next question has to do with the title of the course, which is A New Look at Two Founding Fathers. And I will admit that I am the person, I believe, who came up with that title. But this questioner would like to focus on what are some of the new findings about Washington and Washington's presidency. In what ways do we look at
Well, the big difference is how it's interpreted. And this is called historiography. Historiography is the study of historical interpretation. So during Washington's presidency and, into the early 1800s, we had what was called the great man theory. Today it's called the great person theory. What makes history? People of substance. They decide what's going to happen, and they go ahead and they make history happen. Then you get economic theories like Marx, and it's finances, it's money, etc. Today you have revisionist historians. Now that's come to be kind of a dirty word, and it's come to mean somebody that's lying about historical fact. That's not the case in historiography. Revisionist historians are people that go back and look at interpretations in the past and comment on them and rewrite them, say, here's an alternative to it. So things change. Interpretations change, even though the historical event may stay the same. What's the motive behind it? What's a new motive, etc. Does that kind of get at what you said, or what the question is?
Sure. I apologize. Apparently, I have a unstable connection today. I can't appreciate it on my end until I got kicked off the Zoom session altogether. So I missed part of the answer, JB, and now I'm back. But I think we'll just move on if that's okay. Next question has to do with bounty hunters. Was the bounty hunter paid regardless of the condition or life of the slave? I think that means, in the Old West, we heard about wanted dead or alive. Well, if you returned a slave dead, did the bounty hunter collect his money, his blood money?
You could punish the slave. A
Mhm.
frequent thing that was done to a runaway slave was the Achilles tendon was cut, so they could still work, but they were crippled. And the reason for doing that was you can't run away again now.
Yeah. Yeah.
Also, bounty hunters could be hired by a slave owner. Go find this person, or go find any of my slaves. So you could be working for an income, whether you found anyone or not, possibly receiving a bonus if you did return somebody. Others were independent. They would look for any black person in a northern state and assume that this is a runaway slave and return them, question them, beat them until they said where they were from, etc. And then get paid when you returned the slave. And that might involve some negotiation with the slave owner. Yeah.
And there's a follow-up to this question. Were Northern laws concerning runaway slaves the precursor of modern sanctuary city concept, the sanctuary city, the sanctuary state concept?
Yes. Yep. All of that sanctuary stuff all came out of slave trade. There are churches here in the Twin Cities today that have proclaimed themselves sanctuaries for Hispanic people coming into the United States from Northern South America and Central America. Yeah, I did a lecture on this at the library once, and there were several people there from some of these churches that had declared themselves sanctuary residences.
Yeah. The next question focuses on the limits of office of a president. We limit the office to 2 terms. What if the terms are not consecutive? Does that make any difference?
No, you're still
Mhm.
limited to 2 terms.
Okay.
So you can't
All right.
run, you can't run for 4 years and say I'm not running, then run again and say, well, now I could get to run twice, because no, you're limited to 2 terms, 10 years, consecutive or not.
Okay. All right. And then a comment, the US government, this person says, reimbursed soldiers for the slaves they brought with them to Minnesota. Dred Scott was a slave at Fort Snelling. Did you want to add to that?
Yeah, Dred Scott, actually, it was white people supporting Dred Scott, including, I think, to some extent, his owner. I think Dred Scott's owner was a medical doctor at Fort Snelling, and he brought Dred Scott with him from Missouri. And I think they were at Fort Snelling for 3 years. I'd want to look all these numbers up, but when they returned to Missouri, Dred Scott then sued for his freedom because I had lived in free territory. And the Supreme Court said, no, you can't sue for your freedom. They said, you are property. A chair cannot sue its owner. And you are like a chair, your property. And so the Dred Scott decision was simply having lived in free territory does not make you a free person.
We have just a few more minutes. If anyone has another question, you certainly can type it in at this point. I have a question, so I'll ask my question. What do you think Washington would have thought of his modern successors? I know that he was a Federalist and he probably didn't support the universal franchise. He was a property owner, a very wealthy man. Would he feel that perhaps the results of recent elections were evidence of the unwise extension of the franchise?
Yeah, a lot of slave owners at the time of the Constitution thought that slavery would be limited. It would end sometime in the future. And nonetheless, they were protecting it. But I don't know, it's hard to know what somebody would think. I would think anybody from 1790s looking at the United States today would be shocked. And shocked by a lot of things. Certainly, there would be people like Hamilton who would very much like the state of the federal government and the greater power to the presidency and less power to the states, etc. There are others who would be very much opposed to it. And I think probably, technically, Washington didn't own much in the way of slaves. It was his wife who owned the slaves. Now, he managed them because women weren't allowed to do that sort of thing. But when he died, he could not say these slaves are free. They belonged to his wife, and they were inherited by her family. But where would he stand?
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah. We have one more question just in under the wire. This is going to be a really short question. If a president goes to Camp David, is that considered vacation time?
I don't know. That's the intent of it. It's intended to be a place away from away from the rigors of Washington, D.C., but it's not that old a place. I don't think it's 100 years that Camp David has existed.
Yeah.
And most presidents, even though there is a Camp David today, have other places to go. Frequently, they're people of wealth. Gerald Ford said, well, I don't have another place to go. He didn't own a big ranch like the Bushes did, or Kenny Bunkport mansion someplace as the elder Bush did, etc. So, yeah, I don't know. The intent of it is, of Camp David, is you can go there and rest, although it has been used to negotiate treaties. It's a comfortable place with cabins, and everybody hopes that it's going to be a place where people can talk with each other. So good. Thank you.